Two of the investment summit ended on a high note. This as some of the world's leading businesses pledged billions of rand into the South African economy. 10 companies pledged over 290 billion rand into the country's economy in 5 years.
The event was attended by captains of industry, including Chinese business magnate and Alibaba executive chairman Jack Ma Yun. President Cyril Ramaphosa, who gave closing remarks, thanked all businesses for their pledges. He commended Amazon, a leading American cloud and computing company, for re-entering the South African market.
Amazon's re-entry and bolstering their own investment here in the way that they are going to do means that we have now embraced the fourth industrial revolution. It's no longer a concept that we need to be afraid of and need to have trepidation in terms of dealing with. We're now there, and companies like Amazon and a number of others in the ICT sector are going to give us the capabilities, and they are going to bolster the capabilities of our young people, because our young people, by and large, are already there, if not way beyond, and all they need are pathways. And Amazon and a number of other companies are going to enable our young people to get the pathways, to be coders, to be creators, and to be innovators.
Meanwhile, the president says while new pledges have been made, South Africa needs to go after other pledges made by countries a few months ago.
These investments are also in addition to pledges of over 400 billion that we have received from several governments, several countries over the last 6 months. Our envoys, our ministers, and myself have been going around the world, and in the course of these journeys, we've received pledges that we are now going to follow up, and many of these amount to 400 billion rand. These still need to be really buttoned down. We still need to bring them home. But this 290 billion is what is now in our hands. And this bird that is still flying out there, we want to bring in. And that is the 400 billion birds that we want.
More than 1,000 delegates are attending a gala dinner at this hour. Jack Ma Yun is expected to give his address later. Janjita Uke, SABC News.
For more on this story, we are now joined via Skype by economist Viv Govender from Rand Swiss. Viv, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on the Globe. Now, just listening to that package by President Cyril Ramaphosa stating that there is still an outstanding amount in terms of pledges of 400 billion rand that is still flying out there, and using birds as a way of describing that it's still flying out there and it needs to be honed in and brought into the country and made tangible. What's your take on this? 290 billion rand already pledged by big business, 10 companies. There's more out there, 400 billion. What's your take on President Cyril Ramaphosa's outlook and the response from business?
Yes, about 290 billion is equivalent to about $20 billion. That's a nice round number. And I think that originally when government was talking about investments being brought in by the government, they were looking at a target of about $100 billion, as what they were looking for in terms of South Africa's target for investment. So we're about 20+% of the way there with what's already been brought in hand, like the government mentioned. And there is more than half the way there if you consider what's, the government thinks it's likely to get, already has got inclinations it might be getting. These are obviously large numbers, but remember South Africa is a very large economy, and this is not a once or a big flow that's coming in immediately. It's going to be spread out over a few years. So it's a large number, but it's over a few years, and South Africa is a very large economy. So we need to have a bit more than this, to kind of get us on a pathway. But it's a nice start.
Viv, a lot of pledges in terms of the amounts have been coming from internal companies, for instance, Vodacom and other big business, the IDC, for instance, also making a huge pledge. Aspen, in terms of their 3.4 billion that they spoke of, and the types of developments that they're talking about. For instance, just looking at Aspen as a company and being based, I think he said, in the Eastern Cape, where there's a lot of work that's going to be done with regards to anesthetics made in South Africa, and these are going to be used globally. A huge change in terms of the inward look of a lot of companies and a lot of business. What's your take, especially with the approach of President Cyril Ramaphosa and his government?
Yes, I mean, it's obviously the best kind of investment that South Africa needs is manufacturing investment into manufacturing service, manufacturing industries rather. The reason I say this is because we in South Africa often think that we are unique in the world. There's no comparisons as to what we want to be. But if you look at the world has like almost 200 countries out there, and a number of countries have done the things that we want to do. So we should look at where China was in the 1990s, 1980s, and what they did over the next couple of decades. Look at what Japan did from the 1950s onwards, South Korea from the 1960s, 70s onwards. These are the countries you want to look at and say, okay, they went from being, to give an example, South Korea in the 1960s was as poor as Ghana, and now they make Samsung phones. Japan, also incredibly poor, now, a very wealthy country. And more recently, China, 20, 30 years ago, significantly poorer than it is right now, and they've had like 8 to 10% growth rates for decades in a row. And what the common thread through all these countries has been is manufacturing. They all start off manufacturing, often not very high quality goods, not very high value add goods. But then they get expertise and they start building up on the manufacturing sector, and so they go from basically making cheap trinkets to making cars. And in the case of Japan, which is the furthest along the way, very, very high tech equipment, including owning the high tech equipment companies in their own countries, and they've all had that pathway from in terms of manufacturing, and that's the pathway I think is the most likely and the best one for South Africa to try and follow. That being said, if you look at some of the investments here, I think one of the biggest ones I've seen is being Anglo's, which has put in about 70 billion, or around about that number. This is a good investment. I mean, we're talking about the numbers talked about close to 100,000 jobs apparently related to those investments. So it's not a bad thing. But in terms of what the actual target for us for investment should be, you shouldn't say no to anything, but the ideal target should be manufacturing investment. The building of factories, the hiring of lower skilled workers, and that's really going to change the game in South Africa for employment, etc.
Now, Viv, let's talk about the difference between South Africa now and South Africa a couple of years ago, and with regards to President Cyril Ramaphosa and his approach in terms of dealing with business and being more inclusive of business, where a lot of political analysts have come out and said there's a huge difference with regards to how government is handling investment, looking at inward first before external. What's your take on this, and the fact that there's a competition with regards to investors looking at stability and policy in different potential investment destinations?
Of course, I mean, the best investment would be local because they're more committed, let me say, to the South Africa project as opposed to international investors, which may decide down the line that they're not as committed. And there has been, talk of, in inverted commas, an investment strike by South African companies over the last couple of years, and the numbers talked about are quite large, in excess of R1 trillion. That's 1,000 billion rand. So that is bigger than even the numbers of the pledges that we talked about recently. So there is a ways to go towards getting that money off balance sheets and into investable, endeavors in the country. But investment follows success. So if it's seen that the investment that's made now, this 290 billion, makes huge returns for the investors that decided to go for it, it'll just basically cause an influx of investment from not just South African companies, but from international companies as well. We would see, anywhere in the world right now, people are looking for places to park their money to get, a return for their investments. And if South Africa can show that it's, a good place to get a return, that's a very positive thing. One thing that the Cyril Ramaphosa government has done is it's brought back, I think, a certain level of trust in terms of, firstly, the integrity of the government, and secondly, I think, in terms of the competence of the government. I mean, one of the things that I think has been overlooked in terms of the Zuma administration was not just that, there was corruption and allegations of corruption, but there was also a belief that the government as well wasn't functioning as well as it could have. I mean, those that watched the SARS interrogation or the SARS investigation could see, individuals in the IT sector there who obviously weren't, suited or weren't very competent in what they were doing in that particular sector. And I think one thing that we can do in South Africa is show not just a non-corrupt government, but also a well-functioning government. And I think that, combined with good returns to investment, would cause, companies to come on their own volition to South Africa.
Now, Viv, just to quote the president, he mentioned earlier, or he stated earlier in one of the discussions at the summit, that we are repositioning our country, just to quote him, and we're repositioning our economy. Beyond this, I'm confident that we will have done a pretty good job of putting South Africa on a winning path once again.
Yes. But in terms of what I'd like, in terms of what I'd like to add on, is he mentioned the fourth industrial revolution. This is something I think that we should be aware of. Even in countries that are right now doing very well, places like the US, places like the UK, they have a serious problem with adjusting to the growth in the new technologies, the new industries that are coming about. We've seen in places like the US, for instance, huge companies like Sears got the business because of the innovation brought by Amazon. So even though we're preparing the path that we are on, can't just be satisfied with getting back on the track we were in the 2009, for instance. We've got to basically get back on that track and then start improving our track record, because we are going to be facing a world that's going to be more and more competitive, more and more difficult for a worker to operate. And that's something that I don't think I've taken full cognizance of as yet.
Now, Viv, just very quickly before we wrap up, he also mentioned earlier the fact that there's a lot of patriotism that seems to be outflowing and overflowing within the summit, when he mentioned the fact that during the breakaways, where there was discussions and, everyone was in different sessions at different times, he mentioned that once they all came together, there was a lot of talk of patriotism. Do you think that now the inward looking of South Africans and the appreciation of what South Africa is in terms of its potential economically and, growth-wise, is this a good thing for a country like South Africa, especially looking at the target with regards to investment that needs to come into the country?
The economist Keynes mentioned a phenomenon called animal spirits. He talked about why people invest in anything. It's not just to do the calculation of the numbers and so on. To a certain extent, there's a requirement of almost a belief project. It's like an animal spirit. It's something that's emotional. And having a strong patriotic core is obviously a good start. But at the same time, we do need to make sure that the investments that are basically undertaken have these strong returns. Because, like I mentioned, if we can show good returns to the money coming in, more money will flow in with ease, and the Africans as well will have more money to invest. If, however, we do see these investments initially being quite positive, not have the good returns or have some hiccups along the way, we will find that they will pull out and new investments will be much more difficult to bring in. So, yes, it's good to have a patriotic foundation, but we also need to start showing results for investments brought in.
Viv, thank you so much for joining us. We'll leave it there for now. That was economist Viv Govender from Rand Swiss joining us via Skype.